Well, hello everyone. I'm Michele Guinness, and it's lovely to be able to have some time with you and share some ideas and some thoughts and maybe some stories too. And what I have in mind to share with you is quite an amazing verse that some of us find quite difficult at times. And if I were to say to you, what do you think was the absolute essence of Jesus' teaching? What would you say? Because that's exactly what the Pharisees ask him. They say to him, "Teacher, Rabbi, what is the nub of your message? What is it exactly that you are trying to say?" And Jesus replies, and it's quite ingenious this. He says the first thing is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength. Well, actually, he's quoting Torah. That's Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. And your neighbour as yourself. Now then he takes in and he brings in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. And the reason that's ingenious is that the Pharisees had this thing that the best sermons brought two completely disparate verses of Torah together and preached the best sort of sermon from them. Now, Jesus has gone one better. He's not only brought two disparate verses together, he has actually taken the first three of the 10 commandments of Torah, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and then he's tied them with the last 7, which is love your neighbour as yourself and how to do that. I'm not over keen on the word commandments. It doesn't actually truly convey what the Hebrew says. Many of you know that I come from a Jewish background. I'm not an expert in Hebrew, but I've just got a little smattering after years of learning it as a child. And the word actually commandment is probably better as instruction or guidance or guidelines. And the word Torah comes from the root word yareh. Yareh actually is quite interesting. It's an archery term. In other words, it's how to hit the bullseye of life. So what we have here in Torah is actually 10 instructions or guidelines on how to hit the bullseye of life. Now, if you're like me on this love the Lord your God with all that you've got idea, you probably come a bit unstuck, because one minute you think, of course I do. I love God with absolutely all that I am. And the next minute you're saying, where are you, God? Why aren't you answering my prayers? Why do you feel so far away? And you wonder deep down in your gizzards whether you actually do love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength. So why don't we put that verse back into the Hebrew context that Jesus knew and see if it gives us some clues about how we can actually use them to hit the bullseye of life and discover what the actual nub of worship is. Worship actually being the theme, I think, for Spring Harvest next year. So let's look first of all at heart and mind. I'm going to tie them together, and this is why. Because the Hebrew word for heart is lav or lave. For us, heart in our culture has a sort of romantic meaning as what I feel. But actually, in the Hebraic context, it means brain, intelligence, your understanding, or actually your mind. So those two things go together, and often you do have in Hebrew two words that mean the same thing. So it's with your heart that you reason and you question and you think. Now, isn't that great? Because if loving was just about how we felt, how many of us would stay married for longer than a week? A previous Archbishop of Canterbury's wife, Mrs. Fisher, was asked once at a girls' public school where she was giving a talk on, she was saying how hard it was to be married to an archbishop, and the girls said to her, one of them stuck up a hand and said, Mrs. Fisher, have you ever considered divorce? And she skewered her with her eye and said, divorce? Never. Murder? Often. Probably some of us can identify with that. You see, God doesn't say to us, children, I want you always to be happy. And certainly the Apostle Paul, who suffered shipwreck, beatings, imprisonment, I don't think he was always happy. But you see, it's nice when we are, but our feelings depend on circumstances, and we have no control over the circumstances that affect us. But the thing is, you see, we can control our will. And God will never ask of us what we cannot will. So how does that fit in with loving with all your heart? Well, I've got a few practical suggestions that might help, might not. Just take what is helpful and don't worry about the rest. The first thing is, for me anyway, set times of prayer. Jesus prayed 3 times a day. He just stopped and prayed the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And it was just a moment, which I think we need too, maybe 3 times, even more often during the day, where we just stop in all the bustle and the hurry and the stress, and we say, hang on a minute, Lord, you are the centre of the universe, and I am not. And it just refocuses us, and it just takes us back to what is the nub for us. And it sustains us, that sort of discipline, I think, through the bad hair days. And of course, Jesus had other times of prayer when he went alone up a hill, climbed a hill. I think it was a good physical exercise that enabled him to pray too. I seem to like archbishops, don't I? But the last archbishop, Rowan Williams, was once asked, what is the sort of centre of your spiritual world? And he said, I can't be sustained spiritually through a single day without having 20 minutes with Jesus first thing, even if that means getting up at 5 o'clock. Wowee. I could never manage that, I don't think. But we can pray, you see, as we walk, as we travel to work, or maybe these days as we work. I have a prayer board in my loo. It's got all the photos there of all the people I like to pray for, my favourite people. I go in there several times a day. I might as well make it a spiritual experience. Second thing, prayer's the first. Second thing is study. Do you have any of those moments where you actually sit down and wrestle with the text? And the Jewish sages said this, with a text, it's like squeezing an orange. Squeeze it till the juice comes out. And then when you think you've got the lot, just give it another squeeze. You see, study is going really much deeper than just reading the text. And we really need to know that text, because the sages also said that our best worship is obedience. And how can you obey if you actually don't know what the text says? And so they also said that one day when we get to heaven, the angels will say to us, when did you have your regular time of study? Study is that time when actually we get books, favourite books, we buy spiritual books. There's a mass of stuff to choose from out there, and we get hold of commentaries and we dig deep, and we begin to see things we've never seen before. Third thing, sing. Sometimes sing loudly if you get the opportunity. I find that really works for me, going off somewhere to a place where no one can hear me, or even sitting in the bath and having a good sing. Some of our most popular hymns and songs come out of moments of intense pain. Brian Dawkson, that lovely songwriter, tells the story of how Brian has 6 children, 2 of whom are severe special needs, and he had the most dreadful week where these 2 were up every night and he'd had no sleep. And he was on his way to lead worship at church on a Sunday morning, and he just said to the Lord, I can't do this. How am I supposed to worship this morning? And he said he clearly heard a voice in his head say to him, come, now is the time to worship. I just always love that whenever I sing that song now. You see, loving God, it really isn't about our feelings. It can't be, can it? The Hebrew word for worship is actually avodah, and avodah means service. So I think of all those who worship at church events. You remember church? the one with the building, and where we had these wonderful do's. And who was it who cleaned up the chocolate fudge cake out of the carpet afterwards? Who is it who puts fresh paper, loo paper, into the loos? That is service. That is equally worship. And it's not worshipping with feelings, it's worshipping with every practical ounce of our bodies, isn't it? Fourth thing, cultivate wonder. Cultivate wonder. I had really no wonder in my childhood, and I've had to learn. I mean, my mum is in a care home, and a room became available with a view over the garden, and we said to her mum, would you like to move rooms? And she actually said to us, 3 kids, I've never cared for a view. That will tell you a lot about my childhood. I mean, I had to learn to stop and marvel at what was around me. I'm a great G.K. Chesterton fan, and he said this: at the back of our brains, so to speak, there is a forgotten blaze or burst of astonishment at our own existence. The object of the spiritual life is to dig for this sunrise of wonder. We need to look for the sunrise of wonder, to be amazed that the tree outside our house that gets in the way of parking the car, or you have to move the lawnmower around it, is actually not a nuisance. It's a symbol of God's eternal, unchanging presence. It will be there long after we are gone. And so many other things that we need to be aware of as part of God's creation and part of his gifting to us. 5th thing, gratitude. Count our blessings. Apparently it makes us feel really good at the end of the day, especially if we've had a bad hair day, to do that. And the sages again said this: if you can get to 100 a day, you are really a spiritual master. I don't know if you've ever tried to do that. I usually get stuck at about 12, but it's a really good exercise. Lovely to sit in a group sometimes, maybe in a home group, and say, how many can we get to today? Come on, just jot them down. 6th thing, share them with others, of course. Of course, share them. Because in Deuteronomy it says, you shall impress these instructions of mine on your heart and on your soul. There, you've got it, mind. And teach them to your children. Talk of them when you sit at table, when you walk on the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. Now here is Chesterton again. I'm so thankful for Chesterton. Do you know that he actually came to faith through writing the Father Brown books? And Alec Guinness, who played him in I think it must have been the 40s or the 50s, he too found his faith had deepened and grown as he played Father Brown. It's just amazing, isn't it? So Chesterton said this: you say grace before meals, but I say grace before the concert and the opera, before the play and the pantomime, before I open a book, before sketching, painting, swimming, fencing, boxing, walking, playing, dancing, and grace before I ever dip my pen in the ink. No wonder his words were so powerful. Grace before I switch on my computer in the morning? Probably a good idea too, isn't it? So there you have it. Love God with all your heart and mind. Number of practical ways we can do that. But let's move on now to soul. Our heart, mind, and our soul. The Hebrew word for soul is nephesh, and nephesh is your life force. In other words, it's what drives you. So how do we love God with what drives us? 3 ideas here. Number 1, with your desires, your passions, your appetites, and your motivation. Our natural tendencies to succeed, to relate, to eat, to procreate, to indulge ourselves. And here's a goodie. The sages said, offer to God your inclination to do good and your inclination to be self-centered. Because in other words, he doesn't want the nice facade of you. He wants the real you. And actually, in his book, Falling Upwards, the Roman Catholic priest and psychotherapist Richard Rohr said this. He said, if we were without failure, we would remain immature. But if we learn and grow through it, if we come in repentance and we seek to follow God into something new, then we go higher and deeper with him. And so even our failures can be something with which we worship God, and we give him that force in our life, that desire not to be self-centered, but to follow him. 2nd thing, nephesh, our soul. It means your absolute or my absolute loyalty to God in a nation that laughs at our faith. A few years ago, I think I was a fairly new Christian, so it's probably more than a few years. I once dared, when my mother was in a lot of pain with her back, to offer to pray for her. And she has never stopped laughing about it since. In fact, she tells all her friends, or she did for years. And even now, do you know what she said to me one day? When I was in agony with my back, why don't you pray? Let me pray for your mother. Ha, ha, ha. And the temptation is there to say, well, I'm more mature now. I have thought things through. But no, I want to be loyal to what I believed. Loyal to the God that I know can heal you. I know can be a blessing in those times of real difficulty. Pure wool is 100% wool. In other words, there's nothing in the mix. That's our loyalty to God. Nothing in the mix. We are devoted to him. And thirdly, I think I've got 4 ideas actually for Nefesh. This is number 3. Our very will to live, our life force is our will to live. And of course, we all have that. There were stories that emerged from Italy during COVID, weren't there, about Father Berardelli, who supposedly gave his breathing machine as ventilator to a younger man. Now, that didn't actually quite happen like that, but 60 Roman Catholic priests died in the COVID virus in Italy, and apparently they were amazing. They went into the hospitals to be with the sick and the dying and were prepared to risk their lives to be there for those who needed them. John Wesley said this: every Christian should be ready at a moment's notice to preach, pray, or die. Which would you prefer? I still haven't quite worked that one out. I think it's probably the dying that would stretch me. And number 4 for Nefesh, perseverance. Good old perseverance. Hanging on there in difficulty and doubt. Those days where you really wonder if God's there at all or whether he's abandoned you forever. My husband's grandmother, called Grace, I wrote up her story, her diaries, was a very ordinary woman in many ways, but she rebelled against the confines of a strict Brethren upbringing, and she fought for women's franchise, for women's rights, for birth control for women, against all the teaching of the church at the time. But at the end of her life, she had no money and she lived alone in a tiny bedsit at the top of somebody else's house and never complained. Quite extraordinary. And her motto was based on a lovely line from a poem by Carly Wilson Baker. She used to say this to all who knew her: let me grow lovely, growing old. Perseverance, it's keep on going right to the end, whatever life brings us. It means loyalty. It means giving God our very life force and our love. Got a message from somebody. They'll have to wait. Thirdly, our strength. Love God with our mind and soul, our mind, our soul, and our strength. And the Hebrew word there for strength is meod. Meod, and it means our very, our much. Love God with our muchness. And I think for some of us actually at the moment, that's worshipping God with our lessness. Perhaps we've lost work, we've lost financial stability, we've lost all the savings we thought we had, we've lost the future we thought we had. Meod is worshipping with our lessness and our muchness. Loving God with all we have, all we still do have, everything that God has given us, our resources, our talents, our gifts, whatever he's put at our disposal. Now, the Hebrew word for meod is actually, not Hebrew, I beg your pardon, the Aramaic word for wealth, for strength, is wealth. So we worship God with all our possessions, our home, our hospitality, our family, our pets, our car, our mobiles, our computers, our time, especially, with whatever God has given us. There must be 1,000 ways in which we can serve others with all that we have. Sharing our children, that's a funny one, isn't it? But actually I find that I have a lot of friends who are single, and it's wonderful because I can share my kids with them and they just love it, and most of the time, but they're very glad to have them back, or at least they were. My kids are now adults. So I watch my children do the same. other significant adults are hugely important in the life of a child. Another story about sharing what we have. I was at a conference once, and the committee got together to lay the tables and set the room out, and then had a wonderful meal together of homemade quiches and cakes. And the punters started to arrive just as they were finishing eating and clearing away, and saw what we were all eating. And then, as everything was cleared away, they got out some rubbish coffee and tea, and some really rather not nice bought biscuits. And I just thought, I think there's something not quite right about this, that we ate all the goodies and left the other stuff for them. I do not think that is loving God with all our possessions and all that we have, with our muchness. Second thing, our health. Worship God with our health, if we have it, and our limitations, if we don't. You don't want to know about my spinal problems. My spine's a mess at the moment. But I am discovering that we can even use our pain as an offering. And actually, if I do that when I'm lying in bed and I'm very uncomfortable at night and I start to worship through my pain, the next thing I know, it's first thing in the morning, which is wonderful. But I think even when that doesn't happen, our pain is a sacrifice God sees and he welcomes and loves us through and in it. Third thing, our natural abilities and our gifts, our techie skills. I used to think that folks who loved the techie stuff were probably nerds. How did I dare? God bless them. Right through COVID. What would we have done without them? They are wonderful. We need people now. This is the time with brilliant technological skills who could resource us and help us to see our way into the future. Gardening skills we can share, baking. I've got a friend who at the beginning of the lockdown, she baked cakes and took them to every house and put them on the doorstep for each of her neighbours. And now that they're talking to each other again, she said the whole street's different. It's just been amazing, the neighbourliness that has grown out of that one act of kindness. I write, but then I'm mouth on legs, and we're all different. We've all been given different gifts and different resources we share with others. Let's worship God too with our physical strength. Our physical strength. Remember when we needed people to set out chairs at church? If you've got chairs in your church, you remember every event we needed the chair movers. And how I bless God for them. People with DIY skills. The people who get up on ladders and change the light bulbs. And remember to do that. These of you who do that, who are good at it, that's just amazing. That is loving God with your physical strength, your may-odd. And let's worship him with our sporting gifts. I haven't got those, but I know many will have. Eric Liddell, the athlete, the famous athlete, said this: God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. What about those of you and others who train kids, particularly in deprived areas, to do football? Or perhaps those of you who run a church cricket team. In one church I know, the local MP's on the team. He's an imam's son. And what a joy that is. So you see, there are dozens of different ways in which to love God with our strength, and then with our nefesh, our soul, and with our love, our heart and mind. So I simply want to say at the ending, by finishing this, let's not look down on the day of small things. Because if we love God with the ordinary, with the practical, with the gifts he's given us, putting who we are and what we are at his disposal, that's when we hit the bullseye of the spiritual life. A writer called Dorothy Day said, I really only love God as I love the person I love the least. Because the bullseye is loving our neighbour as ourselves, is it not? Isn't it just as well then that loving God with our will is what's important and not with our feelings? How could we do that otherwise?